now we know. Here, let's see. Anti-communism, anti-Judaism, anti-Semitism, so he was against the religion, against the ethnicity of Jews, against, wait, oh no. It, man, I'm gonna have 3 videos. So he wasn't for, um, Israel being a place. He was, a Catholic fascist, corporatist. So that's like a distribute. It's like a union. They're left economically, right culturally. Imperialist. So that means he was for conquering, like colonialism. He was for media because he did the newspaper. He was a traditional Catholic, and I don't know what that is. National Bolshevik. So yeah, he was a right wing, culturally, left wing, economically, uh, which is usually Nazbol. So that's interesting. Okay, back to the video. 3 minutes. I gotta
We get to talk about his
call the
ideology. He was a
Chick-Fil-A
fascist,
place.
absolutely, but like most local proponents of that particular shit show, he put his own uniquely Canadian spin on things. For one, he believed in Christian morality above all. To him, Christianity was the basis point of Western civilization, and thus fascism and Nazism were fundamentally Christian movements, choosing to conveniently ignore the fact that Hitler was oppressing the
Yeah,
shit.
they call that positive Christianity. It's basically like Jesus was an Aryan instead of saying that he was a Jew. They want to like Aryan wash it. So,
Of the Catholic Church. In
re-editing
Arkansas, Canada, laws and
history.
ethics were to be based exclusively on Christian principles. In the same vein, he held a very traditional view of society at large, especially in regards to city culture. He believed that humanity's place was on the frontier and that cities were hives of scum and villainy, choosing to conveniently ignore the fact that Arkan himself had never lived outside of a city or sizable town. Politically, he was pretty generic. Liberals suck, Jews run everything, we need a dictatorship, whatever, boring, overdone shit. Economically is where he's a bit more interesting. He supported the idea of corporatism, but explicitly opposed the capitalism that corporatism usually came with. He wanted trusts busted, unions empowered, and
It's been an hour and 16 minutes, but it was divided into three because it disconnected once and then it disconnected just recently. So, but I've really been streaming in total for an hour and 16 minutes.
corporate workers' councils established. He also was an early proponent of nationalizing all of the utilities through direct expropriation, especially electricity, which ironically would actually be partially implemented by future governments of Quebec. Basically, he hated capitalism just as much as he hated the commies. Finally, his main quirk was his take on, I guess you could call it culture. As established, he was an Anglophile and loved the British Empire. He believed that weakening it would be bad, opposing things like the Statute of Westminster in 1931. He took the more pro-British view of Canadian Confederation, that the union between Anglo-Canada and Francophone Canada was a pact between brother nations. The French-Canadian people especially were his supermen because they were, in his eyes, a hybrid race of British and French, making them basically the best people out there. Therefore, the two should be equal within Canada as a broader entity, and breaking them up would be dangerous because it would make it easier for the United States to worm its way into things. He was anti-nationalist for Quebec, but pro-nationalist for Canada as a whole, if that makes sense. This drove a wedge between him and other Quebecois groups who supported separatism, and there would be occasions where his fascist rallies would be picketed and invaded by other fascists who didn't like him. He was also very racist, as you may expect, although weirdly not towards the natives. He took the noble savage approach because in his eyes, when was the last time you saw a Jewish indigenous man? I'm not even making that up. That was basically his justification. Well, that and he saw them as a people of strength and will who were willing to stand up and perform their duty or whatever that may be.
Hmm.
Still racist, but with a hint of respect. Other than that, he held a host of pretty standard fascist ideas. On that line, the PNSC was a
That picture of him is like creepy as hell. Don't you agree, Oxalate? Look at that. Look at that face. Ain't no way. Ain't no truggin' way. I let that dude in power.
Very standard fascist party as well. They had their own
They call him Evil Walt Disney for a reason in Hearts of Iron 4.
rank system based off the one he used with the Bobolinks before this, used the funny salute, wore uniforms. These ones were blue and they were called the blue shirts. And their first logo was literally a fucking swastika. He even started another newspaper for the party, Les Fascistes Canadiens, to be its mouthpiece. The party program called for English and French supremacy over the land above all, and a return to a colonial spirit which would see land placed in the hands of Canadians in huge numbers. It was kind of similar to Pelly's ideas, if you remember that video. His blue shirts were called the Légion, a group of tough-looking guys who marched around and trained in combat to support a theoretical revolution and rough up political opponents. The party also had a women's section run by his wife of all people, who, despite Arcan's traditionalism, was actually kind of a girl boss, I'm not gonna lie. As for numbers, Arcan loved to lie to make his group seem important. He at one point claimed membership was as high as 100,000, which is mathematically horseshit. In
Oh, it's
actuality,
4
it was probably
o'clock?
close-
Shoot. I'll just... You can listen to this. Alright. I gotta call them. So actually, I'm gonna be working today. So I gotta end this. Here. I have to work today. Yeah. It's not really like I'm gonna be. I may just wait till 4:30 this time because I'm not gonna eat anything. Yeah, hang on. We can watch the rest of this
Closer to
video.
1,000 or even less, which made him sizable but not really a threat. Didn't stop the media from being the media and acting like he would bring the sky down with the 3,000 black fighter jets of Allah, which ironically boosted his numbers in practice by making him seem like he was actually a big deal. Despite this, his movement never really became a serious political force and became even less so after everyone started getting mad at Germany. One of Arcan's few allies was, incidentally, Maurice motherfucking Duplessis. The Union Nationale was very conservative, both socially and economically, so he and Arcan naturally had a few similarities between them. Unlike with the Fed cons, Duplessis and Arcan would openly support each other on several occasions. The Union Nationale got very favorable press in Arcan's papers, and in return, the Union let Arcan operate his little fascist escapade in the open with no governmental resistance. He also did his best to work with one of the only other Canadian fascist groups to actually like him, that of the Canadian Nationalist Party, which was an Anglo group based in fucking Winnipeg of all places. While his friends were few, his enemies were many. The church hated him, Quebec nationalists hated him, liberals and leftists hated him, the Jews hated him, etc., etc. He, of course, hated them all back. Funnily enough, he also hated the Habs, not just because they are a dogshit hockey team, but because their coach was a Jew at the time. Yeah, he was
Oh.
that petty. Finally, he continued his journalism by writing many pamphlets, books, and papers regarding his ideology and the Jews. The big one was called The Key to Mystery, in which Arcan attempts to prove the protocols of the Elders of Zion and build on the things advocated by that particular document. This publication actually had decent circulation, especially in the international world of the far right. His new fascist party did not change the fact that he was piss poor, so he needed to get a real job, which is where Eugene Berthiaume comes back into play. Now, I want to make a side tangent about this guy because he He is literally him, by the way. He is the main character. He was, among other things, a newspaper tycoon, a bootlegger, an owner of a European advertising firm, a literal fucking merchant who sold basically anything he could get his hands on, imported from far-flung regions of the world, a tobacco baron, an international con man, a businessman, an investor, and so much more. He was the guy to sell you a deck of marked cards and then report you to the casino for cheating to claim a reward. He had an obscene amount of money amounting to tens of millions of dollars today. He was the real deal, but he was consistently unable to force out du Tremblay despite his best efforts. Anyways, he gave Arcane a job. That was it, basically. Eugene owned a paper called L'Illustration Nouvelle, and he liked Arcane, so he brought him in as an editor to use his experience. All told, Arcane was a solid employee, and he apparently never did any of his fascist ranting on the clock. Fun stuff. He held his job for a while, actually electing to be a salaryman by day and a demagogue by night. During his nights, he made moves. On July 1st of 1938, the PNSC would merge with the Canadian Nationalist Party and another group called the Canadian Union of Fascists to form the National Unity Party of Canada, with him as its leader. The swastika was dropped, mostly because of the Pope condemning the Nazis, and in its place was a torch. Upgrade, in my opinion. Arcane finally got his wish of leading a truly Canadian fascist party. The NUPC didn't really experience any significant growth or strength during its time in existence, but Arcane continued anyway. He basically made himself big and loud, publishing his newspapers full of political attacks and anti-Semitic remarks, and trying his best to get into the pockets of sympathetic conservative politicians. He also spoke at a few rallies in the United States and went on the offensive, trying to pull as many Canadians into his party as physically possible. He held numerous rallies and closed-door meetings, flanked by his blue shirts, promising an end to the Great Depression and a national rebirth. Through mud and blood, Canada would be rebuilt in his vision, and all he needed was a few good men to help him do it. However, like I said, he never became that major force destined to overthrow the liberal establishment in Canada, being unable to conjure up consistent support from large numbers of people. Meanwhile, Illustration was struggling financially, and Eugene was hard-pressed to keep it afloat without dumping an obscene amount of money into it, so he made a deal with Arcane where he would take over part of the paper's operations and a chunk of its stock in exchange for getting it back on its feet. He almost succeeded, trying to secure a favor and some money from Duplessis in exchange for helping one of his buddies win an election, but he ended up losing anyway, so no money for him. Debts piled up, wages got cut, and people protested, and this paper too teetered over the abyss. It stuck around for a little bit longer, though. Long enough for Arcane to stay on his own feet, at least. By September 1st of 1939, Arcane was kinda just vibing. He had a reasonable attempt at politics, had a modest income, and was trying to save yet another paper. What could possibly go wrong? Hitler invades Poland and shit hits the fan. Arcane immediately started antagonizing the federal government and threatening to march on Ottawa. He also took multiple vacations for health reasons, which led to his resignation from the newspaper in early 1940. It promptly went under and was sold to the Union Nationale, who rebuilt it as the Montreal Matin and turned it into a propaganda outlet. Arcane picked a funky time to leave, as while he was resting, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police were taking measures. Fascism was now the definitive enemy, and the enemy needed to be dealt with before they could cause problems for the war effort. So, people started getting raided. Dozens of Arcane's allies and party members had their homes raided and materials seized. Starting in May and June of 1940, they broke out the stick, arresting several high-ranking members of the NUPC. Arcane was still out in the countryside relaxing by a lake when, on May 30th of 1940, he was arrested by the RCMP rather suddenly. Under the War Measures Act, Arcane and most of his goons were basically banned from defending themselves. Suspension of habeas corpus and all that. They were charged with a whole bunch of vague things that amounted to not supporting the war effort and actively working to harm it, but in practice it was sedition without the death penalty. Almost immediately after his arrest, most fascist and communist organizations in the country were banned for the duration of the conflict. Arcane's boasting about imaginary numbers of troops came back to bite him in the ass, as his claims were used against him during his trial. He was sentenced to being kept in a prison camp for the remainder of the war, specifically being sent to the Petawawa military camp in Ontario. It was an ideal place to be kept a POW by nature of it being situated in the nice, calm middle of fucking nowhere. All told, his captivity wasn't that bad. It was isolating and boring, but he was kept in fine conditions and was allowed considerable leisure time. His little fascist system even kept itself alive, as all of the NUPC prisoners were sent to the same place. He was treated like any high-ranking POW, but he was bullied and assaulted by individuals on occasion. He stayed there until July 3rd of 1945, when he was released into a very, very different Canada. His network was all but destroyed, he had no job prospects, and most people hated him. Oh, and he was still poor as shit. Not a great place to be. The family relied on generosity for a while, moving to the village of Lanneray, where a friend of theirs offered to shelter them. Here, he lived a very simple and shockingly normal life. He did odd jobs to support his family, got into painting, you know he played Black Templars, and even made a bit of money off of painting portraits for people. He had a bit of luck in other fields.
That is so ironic because Hitler did the same thing. It's like I don't know what it is with painters. They just become like far right, you know? Hitler, painter. This guy, painter. Coincidence? I think not.
Fields, though. Fascism wasn't the enemy of the day anymore. The NUPC was even unbanned after the war ended. Even better, the government started cracking down on communism in the country. The only member of parliament to ever be convicted of espionage was one Fred Rose, coincidentally the only communist MP the country has ever had. He called for Arkan to be arrested and tried for being a fascist, to which the RCMP responded by, deporting him to Poland. The feds essentially told Arkan that he wasn't a problem anymore, which made him kinda mad, but what could he do? This is where Arkan makes an ally so unexpected that I genuinely put the book down when I got to this part. One of the only people to come to Arkan's defense over how he was treated by the feds during wartime was a relatively unknown, up-and-coming law student named Pierre Elliott Trudeau. He wrote an article in a journal that criticized the use of the War Measures Act, mentioning Arkan specifically during the war
No
as
way.
undemocratic, unjust, and unchristian, flying in the face of the inalienable rights of man, which is just, what? Ignoring that he was
Trudeau.
openly sympathizing with a literal fascist for a moment,
Is
do
that
I
the
need to
same
remind
Trudeau?
y'all of something? Exactly two motherfuckers have been unjust and
Dude, that's so weird.
Trudeau. Relatively unknown up-and-coming law student named Pierre Elliott Trudeau. He wrote an article in a journal that criticized the use of the War Measures Act, mentioning Arkan specifically during the war as undemocratic, unjust, and unchristian, flying in the face of the inalienable rights of man, which is just, what? Ignoring that he was openly sympathizing with a literal fascist for a moment, do I need to remind y'all of something? Exactly two motherfuckers have invoked the War Measures Act since the end of World War II, and one of those was Pierre Elliott Trudeau, and the other was his son. God, I fucking love history. Sometimes you just get shit like this and it makes it all worth it. Anyways, he bought a small house in 1949 where he intended to settle permanently, which would be where the last chapters of his life played out. Now, as I've touched on a couple times in the past, the extreme right had a bit of an issue
First off, this guy looks like a crossover between Richard Nixon and Ben Shapiro.
in the years following World War II. Their great fascist saviors of the West had been utterly crushed by the superiority of Allied arms, and Germany itself had been, at least temporarily, completely erased as a concept. So all of the leftover fascist, Nazi, and reactionary groups hanging around the West had a dilemma. What do? Arkan was intent on continuing his attempts to achieve something, but this time he would be more subtle about it. Uniforms and marches and rallies weren't really going to fly as much as they did before the war started, so instead of attempting some revolution, Arkan was far more diplomatic. In 1949, he would actually run for a seat in the House of Commons, coming in second place behind the Liberal incumbent. He ran again in 1953, this time with support from the Union Nationale, coming in a shockingly close second place once again. He was actually a semi-popular public figure by this point, hampered only by the fact that he was still quite impoverished and consistently in poor health for most of the 1950s. As a result, he wouldn't stand for any elections after this, instead opting to use his clout to generate interests for speaking and stuff like that. Much of his program remained the same during this time, just with a new coat of paint, which saw him really fall behind the times, so to speak. During the rise of the Quebec independence movement through the 1950s and 60s, he was utterly stymied by it. He couldn't acknowledge that this course of action was freely chosen by many French Canadians because that would directly defeat the entire purpose of his ideology, instead blaming foreign interference and the Jews and other shit like that. As for other positions he held, he also supported continuous European colonialism in Africa, aggressively denied the Holocaust, opposed the creation of Israel, and continued being super racist, especially towards black people. Overall, pretty generic far-right extremist by this point. The general prosperity of post-World War II Canada also didn't help his case, as the situation again directly contradicted much of what
Well, I do gotta say, it makes sense for Trudeau because actually, what is I'm gonna look up. Look. Look at this. This is his son who did this. Went and put on blackface. That's pretty bad. Anyways. Well, what is, see. Oh, so he was a radical centrist. Alright.
Built a brand off of. He still tried to get things done, but the writing was on the wall and he honestly knew it, so he elected to maintain a more down-low position for the NUPC. He still did maintain many far-right contacts from around the world, the most notable, as you have probably guessed, being Francis Parker Yockey. Yockey visited Arcand in 1950 and stayed over at his place for a few days, and the two got along very well. As for
That's
people
where the National Bolshevism
like
is.
Rockwell, they didn't get along all that well because Arcand believed that the tactics he was trying to employ were outdated and would just get the movement stamped down on harder. Many of these contacts supported him financially on occasion, which made having them around pretty helpful regardless of whether or not he got along with all of them. Regardless, he had a pretty esteemed political life, being heavily involved with both the Union Nationale and the FedCons to a lesser extent. He was even invited to an event in 1962 hosted by the Conservatives where he met and had a chat with John Diefenbaker, the Prime Minister at the time, marking the apex of his political achievement. After this, though, his life started wrapping up. His health had declined dramatically through the 1960s, reducing his ability to actually lead a political organization. The NUPC largely ceased to exist as an actual political force, with Arcand instead electing to host and record lectures designed to keep the spirit alive until such a time that his fascist revolution could occur. He had acknowledged by this point that he would not be the one to carry it out, kind of like Yockey had, so his new plan was to simply prepare the next generation, so to speak. In January of 1967, he handed control of the organization to one of his loyalists in preparation for the inevitable. By this point, Arcand was suffering from throat cancer and kidney failure, and on August 1st of 1967, the second full month of Canada's centennial year, Arcand passed away at the age of 67. His funeral was attended by a fair number of people, with several men in blue uniforms standing guard giving fascist salutes.
Here.
Arcand, ironically, didn't leave much of a legacy behind. The NUPC basically died with him, maintaining a very small number of members that didn't do a whole lot. It formally ceased to exist in 2016, but in practice it hadn't been relevant since his death. Arcand himself is largely absent from the modern Canadian conscious, mostly because he didn't really do a whole lot. If you ask the average person, they probably wouldn't know that it did, in fact, happen here, as potentially uncomfortable as that would be to admit. He was far from a leader of a major national movement, and it's highly unlikely that conditions for a potential rise to power could have ever manifested, so he's kind of just forgotten about. For all of his boasting and prophesying and threats, he just couldn't make people care at the end of the day. He's an interesting skeleton in Canada's closet who is deserving of analysis, but that's about where his legacy ends. Just another whack job extremist to add to the list. That about does it for this video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you around.